Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Cured, A Doctor's Journey from Panic to Peace by McTiernan, M.D., Ph.D. Narrated by Nancy Peterson. Prologue, August 1985. Valhalla, New York. Dead bodies surround me. They lay on their backs, supine in medical terminology. I imagined some staring at the white plastic sheets that covered them completely, others glaring at their closed eyelids. Their smell, a mixture of formaldehyde and death, made me gag. I was no stranger to the deceased. I'd met many of my Irish-American relatives at Catholic wakes and funerals, which were more family parties than bereavement rites. Yet corpses horrified me. They represented the end of life, separation from loved ones, the possibility of a soul's eternal damnation. Now, as a first-year medical student in Introductory Anatomy Lab, I would examine and touch a cadaver daily to learn the mysteries of the human body. I was 32 years old, but terrified that these corpses would drag me into their netherworld. My life before that day was full, yet I felt empty. Married for 9 years, mother to 7-year-old and 3-year-old girls, and recently awarded a Ph.D. in public health, I was successful on the surface. But I'd always felt inadequate, not fully formed. I'd hoped that studying medicine would make me a powerful woman, would help me feel okay about myself. I had fooled the admissions committee at New York Medical College into accepting me. On my application essay, I'd written that I wanted to save others. In truth, I was trying to save myself. I hoped to join the exalted club of physicians, healers, and holders of secrets to long and healthy lives. But raised as an Irish-American Catholic by a single mother, with no father in my life, I felt better prepared to be a maid than a doctor, more suited to be a nun than a wife and mother. Now, as I leaned against the wall of the anatomy lab, my vision dimmed. Everything turned gray. I gulped for air. My arms and legs went numb. I felt that drowning sensation I had in 3rd grade when a nun pushed my head between my legs. Or like the time when I was 8 months pregnant and took a hot shower at the university gym. I prayed that I wouldn't pass out on my first day of medical school classes. I didn't want these MDs to be, all smarter and younger than I, to know I couldn't handle this, that I didn't belong. I pressed harder against the white wall, willing myself to remain upright with the living, rather than supine with the corpses. Little did I know that the enormity of medical school would soon wash over me, causing these drowning-like symptoms to occur over and over again, until I reached out for help. Chapter 1. June 1982. Seattle. It all began 3 years before in Seattle. I sat alone in the middle of the long side of a steel conference table. My 5 inquisitors sat opposite me. The sweat forming on my forehead and underarms bothered me, but not as much as the wetness under the front of my blouse. I had made the mistake of thinking about my 3-month-old baby, hoping she was taking the bottle okay from her dad. Just one mental image of her was enough to trigger my milk letdown reflex. I wasn't sure if my homemade breast pads could hold the deluge. My breasts didn't care that I was in the middle of my University of Washington Ph.D. dissertation defense. With mouth dry and pulse bounding, I'd just given a presentation of my epidemiologic study on thyroid cancer in women. 4 years of painstaking courses, exams, research, data collection, analyses, and writing, boiled down to 30 minutes. Now I was answering questions fired at me by the faculty members, 4 males and 1 female, who had the power to grant or deny me this prestigious degree. To the 29-year-old me, they seemed like ancient and powerful holders of wisdom. In reality, they were 40-something mid-career academics. My Ph.D. supervisor, who was an eminent epidemiologist, a cancer epidemiologist, a thyroid doctor, a statistician, and a female epidemiologist who received fewer accolades and probably lower pay than the rest of them. One by one, each of the professors asked about the study methods and results, and how I might design a better study in the future. After the committee grilled me for an hour, during which time they each showed their own superior knowledge, they told me to wait outside while they deliberated my fate. Thankful to escape, I sat down on a folding metal chair outside the conference room in the antechamber to the School of Public Health's dean's office. This was not the plush, oak-paneled dean's office of an Ivy League school. Rather, the utilitarian government office decor was in various shades of gray. Not a good color choice for Seattle with its perennial steel-hued skies. I shivered, my sweat now evaporating in the typical June air, and tried not to imagine my dissertation committee deciding that I'd never make it as an independent scientist, or that I'd need at least another year's work, or that my research was fatally flawed. I couldn't fail. Academics was the only thing I'd ever excelled at. If I failed, I had nothing to fall back on, no plan B. Other than my extended schooling, all of my positions had been menial. Hotel maid, donut waitress, ice cream shop server, telephone operator, file clerk. I couldn't afford to take any of those jobs. I'd have to spend more in daycare costs than they would pay. My anxiety kept me from feeling as exhausted as I should have been, given the lack of sleep the previous night. Our baby daughter, who slept between my husband and me in our double bed, had decided to nurse all night long. By morning, one breast looked like that of an old woman's in a National Geographic photo, while the untouched breast was engorged to the size of a cantaloupe. The baby slept peacefully when I got up, so I didn't wake her to deflate my balloon breast before leaving for my 8:00 a.m. thesis defense. I hoped the tan polyester suit jacket I'd bought on sale for the occasion covered the discrepancy in breast size. I thought of her little face, how she looked as I left her that morning, petite red eyebrows and eyelids moving as she pursed her lips in her sleep, probably dreaming about Mommy's milk. But that little smile could also have been for her older sister. Why did I experience a milk letdown each time I thought of my younger daughter, I wondered. It was as if our relationship was entirely about food, instead of almost entirely about food. It had been the same with our first daughter, and even as a 4-year-old, she turned to her mom when she was hungry. It contrasted sharply with my relationship with my own mother, where food was a source of punishment. I'd get a beating if I didn't have supper ready when she got home. And she once pummeled my face with raw hamburger. To have food represent the warmth and comfort I could give my children constantly surprised me. I thought back on my graduate student career, unable to believe that it might be finally coming to an end. I'd been attracted to the field of epidemiology while reading scientific articles for my master's degree in medical sociology. My husband Martin and I had come to the University of Washington so he could begin his career as a computer science professor, and I could pursue graduate studies. We'd arrived in Seattle in 1978 with one baby. Since then, I'd received A's in all my classes, easily passed the challenging proficiency exams, designed and conducted an epidemiology study, and this past year had produced a second baby. Now I hoped to be rewarded for my hard work. Epidemiology is all about numbers, numbers with a heart. It's the study of diseases in populations, and our labs are the world of people. Epidemiologists look at large groups of people, obtain data on demographic, health, and lifestyle variables, and investigate whether any of those predict the risk of developing disease. All numbers. But we care deeply about what the numbers represent. All heart. We want to find ways to prevent disease from occurring, to prevent suffering. I had no business getting a PhD. Raised by a single mother in Irish-American working-class Boston, I was better prepared by my upbringing to be a domestic rather than an academic, to be a divorcee than a married mother of two. The first in my family to obtain a college degree, here I was, reaching for the pinnacle of intellectual achievement. By marrying a computer science professor from an upper-middle-class background, I had sped up several rungs on the social class ladder. And now I was trying to go even further. A steady hammering pulled me out of my reverie. Construction, I thought. Although the university was not wealthy, a steady flow of government research grants that year required frequent space adjustment. As the pounding continued, I realized the sound came from the conference room I'd just left. I crept over to it and put my ear to the door, sure that someone would fling it open. I'd fall into the room and the professors would assume I'd been listening through the door. To my surprise, my ear on door distinguished the sound as knocking from the inside. Gingerly, I turned the knob and slowly opened the door. Someone on the other side gave it a pull. I stumbled and just caught myself before falling flat on my face. The 5 faculty members clustered near the door, laughing. "We were locked in," one said. "We thought you'd make us stay here until we approved your dissertation," said another. Without knowing if I'd passed or failed, I couldn't share in their glee. I hoped they hadn't been knocking for long and that the trauma of their captivity wouldn't make them decide against me. "Congratulations, Anne. You passed." My supervising professor smiled warmly as he told me the news. "That's wonderful. Thank you so much." Outwardly calm, inwardly doing jumping jacks, I shook hands with each of the professors. They said nice things about my research and thesis. "What do you plan to do next?" asked the statistician. "I guess I need to submit my thesis work for publication and then look for a job." 2 of the professors leaned forward as I spoke. When I was anxious or unsure of myself, about 90% of the time, my quiet voice became almost inaudible. "Well, there aren't too many jobs in Seattle unless you're really good," said the older epidemiologist. His unspoken assertion was that I wasn't one of the really good. The room darkened, my joy at passing ruined. The problem was that I believed him. I silently agreed that I wasn't really good. I didn't stop to remember that few men described female students or professors as really good. Years later, I realized that some of the glass ceiling in academia is because of inherent sexism. Male professors tend to see female academics as intellectually inferior, as helpers rather than as leaders. But some of the problem lies with how people, including scientists, see the worthiness of others' work and accomplishments. If a researcher speaks and acts with authority and confidence, others accept that. Women, especially young women in training, tend to speak tentatively and softly. I've seen many instances where a scientist repeatedly describes his or her own work as superior and important while the audience nods enthusiastically. And I've seen the converse. The researcher who fails to sell himself or herself is seen as mediocre. While people outside of academics might think that science is such a fact-based field that brilliant results speak for themselves, the opposite is sadly true. There are probably thousands of important results that never got attention because the investigator didn't broadcast loudly and widely enough. The committee members signed my PhD warrant. Such a strange term, the warrant. As if I'd be arrested for pretending to know something, pretending to be smart. How could my professors have been fooled? All but the one who was on to me, who saw my limitations. But even he signed the form. I was officially a Doctor of Philosophy. "Congratulations, Dr. McTiernan," said my supervisor as he shook my hand again. I smiled broadly, but wanted to look behind me for someone with my name who was the real doctor. Bicycling home on Seattle's wooded Burke-Gilman Trail, I tried out my new title, Dr. McTiernan, Dr. Ann, Doctor, Doc. It felt unreal. I knew I wasn't a real doctor, not the medical kind who performs miracles, saves lives, and makes loads of money. But I could still use the title doctor. I might not be really good, but I had the prestige of the PhD. I'd made it. I pulled up to our little bungalow 3 miles northeast of the University of Washington. The house and its neighborhood clones had been built for GIs returning after World War II. Our home had 3 bedrooms, and we'd added a second bathroom. It was the first house I'd ever lived in. As a baby and toddler, I'd lived in daycare homes and institutions, and as a child, I'd lived with my mother and aunt in a series of rented flats in Boston. I loved our little Seattle home, although I looked forward to someday moving up in the world of Seattle real estate. Moving up in Seattle was often literal, such as living on top of a hill that provided a view of water or mountains, which could increase house prices by $100,000 or more. I craned my head to look up at our house that was set above a rockery, thick with overgrown golden alyssum, white candy tuft, and blue lithodora. Horsetails stuck out of every free crevice, as if asserting the dominance they'd had for the past 15 million years. A thick patch of St. John's wort nestled against the front of the house. I hated that plant, but at least it had color for some parts of the year. A 6-foot-tall camellia bush grazed the bottom of the dining room window. Remnants of its glorious magenta blossoms littered the ground around it. I yearned for a gardener to clean up our yard, but we didn't have the funds, and my husband would never agree anyway. "It's not necessary," was his favorite 3-word sentence. Our house had pale blue vinyl siding that we'd had installed after a botched paint job left the wooden siding blistered and peeling. We weren't too eco-conscious in those days, not realizing that the manufacture of vinyl siding requires use of cancer-causing chemicals and that the siding could never be recycled. I leaned my hot pink Schwinn bike against the rockery, knowing my husband would put it in the garage for me. His parents raised him to be chivalrous. Inside the front door, my house smelled of last night's hamburgers mixed with dirty diaper. My 4-year-old daughter greeted me with, "Mommy, can you read me this book?" Rachel was tall for her age, her peaches and cream complexion framed by glorious wavy red hair. The glasses she'd begun wearing that year added to her cuteness, but I secretly lamented not being able to see her beautiful green eyes as clearly now. 3-month-old Cassie wailed when she saw me, as if I'd been away for months. Her own peaches and cream skin reddened with her fury, contrasting with her wisps of tangerine hair. Her blue eyes held tears. She was all perfection, all motion. My husband leaned down to give me a quick congratulatory kiss and left to teach his class. I settled into a normal afternoon with the girls. A sandwich for Rachel, mommy milk for the baby, a half-hour preparation to walk the 5 minutes to the local park. Home again after a half-hour, snack for Rachel, library books on the couch, more mommy milk for the baby. We had furnished our little house almost entirely with hand-me-downs and self-made items. Our maple wood dining room set and 2 Morris chairs had belonged to my stepfather's father. I'd scraped, sanded, and refinished the furniture on a college summer vacation in Massachusetts. A colonial print love seat still bore stains of Cheetos left by the children of a graduate student who stayed with me in Buffalo when she fled her abusive husband. Our stereo set sat on boards Martin had purchased and stained for our first apartment in Toronto. I'd sewn chair cushions, slipcovers, curtains, and bedspreads. A perennially out-of-tune upright Baldwin piano completed our first-floor decor. Martin and I had been married for 6 years. His parents were European Jews who had escaped the Holocaust. My mother had called his family "those people," as when she told me shortly after he and I started dating, "Those people only marry their own kind. Don't waste your time with him." Later she would come to like him more than she liked me, which wasn't saying much. An only child, I'd always dreamed of a big family. Martin wanted 2 children. I had hoped for at least 3, but was reluctant to press Martin on this. I was not a woman of steel. I didn't know how to present my feelings, my wants, so I avoided conflicting topics. That meant I avoided many things. On a rare date night out, Martin would ask what movie I'd like to see. "I don't care," would always be my answer. So I let Martin decide. Luckily, his tastes leaned toward arty, romantic films, and he hated violence on the screen as much as I did. Later in the afternoon, my first thought for dinner was the usual on my nights to cook: order pizza. My husband and I split a can of Miller Lite over dinner to celebrate my success. I watched him as he gobbled several slices. Tall and slender, he never put on weight despite eating copious amounts of food. With his Coke bottle bottom, wire-rimmed glasses, bushy brown hair, t-shirt, and worn jeans, he looked like a typical computer science professor. As I lay in bed that night, I fretted about not being really good, and about my poor chances of getting a job. While my husband made enough money to keep us fed and sheltered, we'd never be able to have some of the things I aspired to, like a Volvo station wagon, Starbucks coffee, Oshkosh clothing for my kids, and a Waterview house in Laurelhurst. And because our 4-year-old daughter had been reading since she was 3 years old, I aspired to private school for her. I needed money. Chapter 2. April 1983 to February 1984. 10 months after my PhD defense, I landed a job. Well, not a real job. Officially, I would be a postdoctoral fellow, a postdoc. I'd joined the illustrious army of highly trained researchers working long hours for little pay, few benefits, and no guarantee of continued employment. In some institutions, people remain in postdoc positions for a decade or more after finishing their PhDs. They support the labs and make brilliant discoveries, but never attain the exalted position of principal investigator. Still, I was excited to be employed and to be able to work in research. In my new position in the University of Washington School of Dentistry, I would investigate the prevalence of cavities. My PhD supervisor, upon learning that an epidemiologist was needed to help with research in the dental school, had referred me. I knew nothing about dentistry outside of my dreaded yearly checkup and the memory of many childhood fillings suffered without anesthetic. Coming from a poor family with no funds for braces, my crooked lower teeth and upper overbite remained uncorrected. I hoped my new boss wouldn't be too put off by my dental deficits. I began my fellowship in April 1983, the typical Seattle spring day, in the high 40s and rainy. Didn't dampen my excitement. Martin had the kids that morning, so I left early to bike into the office. I enjoyed the postage stamp gardens of my neighborhood as I coasted down the slight incline toward the university. Spring arrives early in the Northwest. Crocuses had come and gone in January, followed by camellias in February. Cherry trees peaked in March. Now the rhododendrons were spectacular in my working-to-middle-class neighborhood. After a half-mile, my route dropped me onto the Burke-Gilman Trail. Empty and green, it smelled faintly of cedar. The dental school was located on the university's south campus. The medical complex abutted the easternmost section of the Lake Washington Ship Canal, which linked the lake to Puget Sound via Lake Union. The South Campus was constructed of more than 20 wings built over more than 50 years, with the interior hallways fully connected. My PhD classes had been in the F Wing, and my student Carol had been in a leaking, unheated, moldy annex that shook whenever someone opened the door. I'd now be working in the dental school's D Wing offices. If I'd taken the time, I could have meandered along one of the walkways that line either side of the canal. Years later, as a physician specializing in health promotion, I appreciate the need for exercise and nature to optimize one's health and well-being. But back then, if I wasn't working or studying, I was taking care of my children. I had no time to wander. My little cubicle upstairs in the dental school had an old wooden desk. just big enough to read computer printouts with the reams falling over the back edge. But little work would be done in my office space. All programming had to be done at the South Campus Computing Center. There, I'd type a program into a terminal and give instructions about what data tapes to load. Then I'd walk the half-mile back to my office and wait until I thought my job should be done. Sometimes my program output would be all ready for me, looking fresh and crisp in the computer center's outbox. Other times, I'd have been wildly off in my estimate of job length and would have to decide whether to wait at the center, shifting from one foot to the other, or trudge back to my office. I used data that the U.S. government had collected as part of its ongoing study called the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, or NHANES. Between 1971 and 1974, NHANES dentists examined the teeth and gums of thousands of children and adults across the U.S. They counted the number of cavities and the number of teeth affected. They also examined the health of study participants' gums and recorded detailed information about the size of gum pockets — deeper indicates likely presence of infection and inflammation — around each tooth. I was tasked with studying associations of these data on teeth with some other variables that I cannot recall. I just remember the teeth. My postdoc supervisor was a well-respected academic dentist. When he hired me, he told me that the funding for my salary came from a National Institutes of Health grant, which limited salary to $14,000 a year. Even in 1982 dollars, this was poverty-level wage. "But don't worry, I'll get supplemental funds from my department to raise your salary," he said. "Okay," I said. "But your husband is working, right?" I nodded. "Yes, he's an assistant professor in the computer science department." "So you should be okay with whatever salary we come up with." Stupidly, I nodded again. I never saw that supplemental salary. The work turned out to be mildly interesting, except that dental researchers seemed to be more interested in teeth than in people. Instead of counting the number of individuals with dental decay in a population, they counted the number of teeth with cavities. It would be like breast cancer researchers counting the number of affected breasts instead of the number of women with breast cancer. But I learned some things about a major public health problem and could work with some national data sets. I met weekly with my supervisor in his cramped faculty office, dominated by a bookshelf stuffed with texts like dental anatomy, physiology and occlusion, head and neck anatomy for dentistry, and oral radiology. It always struck me as odd that physicians learned so much about the entire human body but left out the mouth. Dentistry was completely separate from medicine. During our meetings, I'd show him the results of data analyses, and he'd talk at length about his academic career. He told me about his practice and the specialized clinic he wanted to establish. He talked about the grants he hoped to get, and the papers he had written and presented at prestigious conferences. It was a perfect match. He liked to talk, and I didn't know what to say. It went along like this for about a month. I'd analyze more data, show it to him, and he'd say, "Let's keep looking." On the day that his hand strayed to my knee, I decided to look for another job. I couldn't concentrate on his words. I wanted to kick my leg up to dislodge his hand, hopefully mashing his balls in the process. I wanted to scream, "What the fuck do you think you're doing?" even though the F word felt so wrong that I never used it. But I said nothing, frozen by fear of confronting him. I worried he'd take offense and fire me on the spot. And maybe it was just innocent. My husband puts his hand on our 4-year-old daughter's knee. It could be a fatherly thing. I didn't have a dad in my life, so had no experience with fatherly affection. That's it, I decided. It's just a fatherly thing. But if his hand strays up or down, I'm out of there. After suffering for what was probably just a few minutes but felt like an eternity, I quietly said that I had to leave to pick up my daughters. He moved his hand as if nothing untoward had happened, smiled, and said, "See you next week." Biking home that day.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?